The Cincinnati Bengals never fail to surprise us when they cut the roster down to 53 players. And this year, it's 8 guys on the offensive line leading things off. Let's break it down.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Jake Liscow. He's James Rapien, and we're your hosts of the Locked On Bengals podcast, covering your Cincinnati Bengals since 2016. If you're looking for that daily news and analysis, the one-stop shop for all things Bengals, you're in the right place. Everydayers already know it. Welcome back if you're an everydayer. Welcome back if you make Locked On Bengals your first listen. Today's episode, where we will be breaking down the Bengals' initial 53-man roster with surprises in terms of how light they are on the offensive line, keeping an extra body, extra player on the roster at tight end and an extra couple of players potentially at defensive tackle. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Football season right around the corner. Check out the FanDuel app today and start planning your futures bets as we record this on Futures Day at FanDuel.com. Now, James, let's start with one of the bigger surprises, I think, when we talk about this roster, and it's the lack of offensive linemen. They go 8 deep on the offensive line this year. I would say they have like 2.75 offensive tackles on the roster. If you count the backups, that to me is a surprise, going light on the offensive line, a spot where we thought at least 9 and maybe 10 would be kept.
Yeah, I think it says a few things. One, the Bengals' doubts about their depth, or your doubts about their depth, they share those doubts. And whether it was a Devin Cochran, who I just thought they were comfortable enough with, saw him in game action, they're willing to expose him to the waiver wire. They're willing to look at an Andrew Coker and say, yeah, you put some nice preseason film out there, but we're on the hunt. And that doesn't mean that those guys won't be back. Seth McLaughlin won't be back on the practice squad. But in Seth's case, it has a lot to do with him recovering from an Achilles. They feel like they need to open things up a bit and take a look and see what's there. And if it isn't there, they're willing to risk losing one or maybe more of these offensive linemen that we thought they could consider keeping, to keep a player at another position that, to them, whether or not the position is more important is irrelevant because the player's better. It's a guy that might be able to help them. I think that's what this really did come down to with some of these guys. And so, yeah, it is surprising. I mean, 8, if the Bengals are playing tomorrow, Jake, all of these guys are active. Your entire offensive line room is active. You don't necessarily want that to be the case. I don't think it will be. I think that's a good sign that they're going to be looking to add to that room. At the same time, you also should sweat a little bit, I think, if you're the Bengals, because what if you don't get the guy you want to add? And some of these guys that are destined for the practice squad, maybe they don't make it there. So the next 24 to 48 hours are certainly going to be interesting.
Yeah, waivers will be processed, I believe, at noon on Wednesday. The Bengals will be practicing shortly after that. So we'll get an idea of some of the practice squad guys at that point. The players that are currently on the team that make it through waivers and signed to the practice squad should be present at that practice. And if they're spotted, we'll have an idea there. If they're coming in from other cities, probably will not see them. If they're not present at all, it could be that they're still figuring things out. It doesn't necessarily mean anything, or it could mean that they are not on the practice squad. But of the players waived, Devin Cochran and Andrew Coker were the 2 that I had in my 53-man projection. They don't keep either of those guys. Seth McLaughlin, also a player that a lot of Bengals fans were excited for, especially that Ohio State crossover for Seth McLaughlin. He was waived as well. Cordell Volson was waived with an injured designation, meaning he might revert to the IR. We'll see how that plays out. Specifically from a procedural perspective, Tanner McLaughlin was also waived injured, along with Caleb Etienne. But Cochran and Coker wouldn't surprise me at all to see those guys back on the practice squad. Seth McLaughlin wouldn't surprise me to see him back on the practice squad if he is interested in that opportunity. Jackson Kirkland is an interesting one, though, James. That's a player that perhaps a regime change and the new offensive line coach didn't quite
Mm.
think as highly of Jackson Kirkland as the previous offensive line staff and group that was in charge of that unit. I'm totally speculating there, but Jackson Kirkland did not have a great preseason. And sometimes when you have a new set of eyes running things for the Bengals, especially with how involved the Bengals are in their coaching staff and making roster decisions and shaping the roster, I wonder if that was part of it there. But a bit surprised that they didn't keep 9 in the initial cut down. But like you said, it could have to do with players that they prioritize keeping around in some way, shape, or form. And those guys include the extra tight end, the extra defensive tackle. And that is an interesting bit of calculus when you consider where the waiver priorities are expected to be for them now that the initial cut down is complete.
No doubt. And that's it is. And I thought they would view it this way, but it doesn't mean that they're done. They better not be done. And there are, I mean, a bunch of options out there. If you're on Bengals social media, it's like, oh, well, I like this guy then, or I like that guy. You mentioned Scott Peters and being in or not in. That is a good way to look at some of these guys, the Jackson Kirklands of the world that have had multiple injuries, that were considered developmental guys that you think you can get something out of. Well, can they or not? And maybe he'll be back on the practice squad. We'll see. But Cole Strange is someone. How does Scott Peters feel about him? He was waived by the Patriots. He's a former first rounder. He was in New England with Scott Peters last year. Is that a guy that made an impression, even though he was hurt, made an impression on Scott, has the right mentality, has the right, we'll see, because that is someone that, yeah, he never should have been a first round pick, but that doesn't mean he isn't a useful player. Doesn't mean he can't necessarily help you at that guard spot. So that's one guy that I throw out there is someone that they're at least going to have a discussion about. Whether or not they claim him is another story.
Layden Robinson, the Patriots 2024 fourth round pick at guard, also waived by the Patriots, a guy that isn't necessarily a priority. I don't know if either of these guys will be a priority per se, but guys that Scott Peters does have some familiarity with. I would also mention Logan Brown, the tackle from Minnesota, who has been a hot topic of conversation on the offensive line since the potential for him to be waived became apparent. But what will be interesting here is if they go with the veteran route. Trent Brown did not make the team in Houston. I don't know if he's healthy. I don't know if there's interest in reuniting Trent Brown and the Cincinnati Bengals after how his year went, but that would be another name to just throw out there that I think we're familiar with.
Yep.
Probably will be somebody that we haven't talked about or necessarily thought much about in general. But where I'll be interested, James, is one, if they go veteran or waiver or both, and two, where are they targeting here? Because, yeah, we've talked a lot about Dalton Reisner, and Zach Taylor gave kind of a wishy-washy answer, in my opinion, when he was asked about the starting right guard spot in his presser after the cutdown. Do they feel a more pressing need at guard? Or, like I said, I think they have about 2.75 tackles on the team, counting Cody Ford as half of a tackle. I still prefer him at guard. And Jalen Rivers is about 25% of a tackle right now because I think he is right now spending most of his time at guard after how things went early for him at tackle. And they could both be tackles. I think Cody Ford right now, if they had to go play tomorrow, is the first tackle off the bench. But to me, that's a need. Just as much as guard depth might be a need because of what they're feeling on the front end at guard, the back end of tackle just feels shallow to me. And maybe they disagree about how Cody Ford and Jalen Rivers can be used.
Honestly, though, I was thinking about Trent Brown today, and I do think it sounds like he's just going to sign with Houston's practice squad, take it easy to begin the year, and eventually be on their 53-man. But that would kind of be ideal, like a guy that can be your swing tackle, like much like I described last week with Dalton Reisner and how things kind of fit into place if you have a guy like Reisner. It's the same thing if you get a proven swing tackle, a guy that you can trust, because then Cody Ford can be your backup at both guard spots, and you feel a bit more comfortable there going that route. And I do think it's interesting. You mentioned Zach saying he's, wishy-washy. He said, still feel good about where we're at. Wasn't ready to make an announcement. Then he talked about Jalen Rivers a lot. And so is that, I remember saying it on draft day, like when they picked him, like give him a shot at right guard.
Mm-hmm.
Is that close? I just kind of assumed it would be Lucas Patrick, but who knows? I think the next few days could certainly matter when it comes to that right guard battle, just on how those rooms shape up. But
Well, it's just crazy that we're at this point after cutdown, and it's like, yeah, we know who our starting right guard is going to be. That's not the words that came out of Zach Taylor's mouth. He's like, yeah, we think we have that guy on the roster. We'll see how it
I
shakes
wouldn't
out.
say ready is how he said it. I wouldn't say ready.
Yeah.
It's 12
not
days
decided.
away.
Yeah.
12 days away from the opener, Zach. You're not ready.
Mm.
I know he didn't mean that, but yeah, hopefully they find the right guy, Jake. And I'm sure there's a few more thoughts on the offensive line. There's also some surprises in the defensive line room. We'll get to those as well coming up next. Today's show is brought to you by Yahoo Fantasy. And look, almost every one of our shows right now is presented by Yahoo Fantasy because it's fantasy football season. I have multiple drafts this weekend, Jake, and guess what? They're in Yahoo Fantasy. Yahoo Fantasy is easy to use. I've been using Yahoo Fantasy. My first ever fantasy league is in Yahoo Fantasy. I have so many fantasy leagues. I can't even begin where to start. I literally don't know how many I'm in, but guess what? Yahoo Fantasy makes it easy to keep track of all of them in the app, on the website. And obviously I'm playing Yahoo Fantasy and you should too, whether it's your first league, whether it's your millionth league like me. Season kickoff is September 4th, a week from Thursday. Now's the time to start playing Yahoo Fantasy Football, which offers so many fun ways to compete. And the brand new guillotine mode is the mode that I can't wait to try. I've never done a guillotine league, but it's where the lowest scoring team gets eliminated weekly until one team is left. You got to check it out with Yahoo Fantasy. Also, you can play instantly with friends with the new Draft with Friends mode. You prefer the classics, get your crew together, go head-to-head in a private league. And if you don't have a crew, no problem. Join a public league, which is the easiest way to play. The NFL season kicks off on September 4th. Don't wait. Start your league now. Draft now. YahooFantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. That's YahooFantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. All right, Jake, before we dive into the defensive tackle, defensive line, let's just come to the agreement. They need to add. We hope they add. We hope they add someone good that's going to help them, whether it's backing up Jalen Rivers / Lucas Patrick or who knows, maybe even starting in one of those spots.
Or backing up at a tackle spot if they can find somebody they like there. I think we're in agreement there. I think both of us would be surprised if they make it to the end of this week with only 8 guys on the offensive line on the roster. But before we get to those surprises, just a reminder for the people that we don't ask much of you, but we do ask you this one time a year to go check out the listener survey, lockedonpodcast.com/survey. You can give us feedback on what you like, what you don't like, answer questions about our advertising. Again, lockedonpodcast/survey. You complete the survey, you'll have a chance to win one of 10 $100 Amazon gift cards. So there's a chance that there's something in it for you too, if you don't mind checking that out. Again, at lockedonpodcast.com/survey. There's also going to be a link in the show notes if you don't feel like typing all that out. Let's get to the surprises, James. Cam Grandy was on your 53-man projection. Not necessarily a surprise to you. And as we discussed when we were having that conversation, it was something that I could buy. I could have seen them going 9 on the offensive line, keeping Cam Grandy. I think what surprises both of us on the defensive side of the ball is that Eric Gregory and Howard Cross both make the team. We both had a feeling that there's a chance Howard Cross could make it. I think I had him on. Maybe you didn't have him on. I can't remember. Maybe we both had him on.
Yeah, I had Taven Bryan.
Right.
And that got punted to the sun on Monday.
Yeah. But between our recording of the prediction and the Trey Hendrickson episode, that's right. And then Eric Gregory also making it. And so surprising because it wasn't as obvious. Like Howard Cross was repping with the ones in the absence of BJ Hill in training camp practices. Eric Gregory was playing just as much as Howard Cross in that preseason finale. And I do know that there are fans in the front office, scouting department of Howard Cross. Of Eric Gregory, sorry. I know that they liked Eric Gregory from a scouting perspective. He was their highest paid college free agent. Could be a move to just protect one of these 2 guys from the waiver process. I think I would be surprised to see them stick with 6 on the defensive interior, just as much as I'd be surprised to see them stick with 8 on the offensive line. But those 3, I think, are the biggest surprises when you take everything into account.
Yeah, it's wild to think of, and I don't necessarily blame them. I think to me, this is the Lawrence Guy impact. The impact of having to go and turn to Lawrence Guy last year. And they looked around and they're like, all right, do we like this guy in Eric Gregory? We do. Do we think we could develop him? We do. And maybe that's front office, maybe that's coaches, maybe that's both. And same thing goes for Howard Cross III. Obviously, he has the rapport with former Notre Dame defensive coordinator Al Golden, who's now leading the charge here in Cincinnati. So you look at it from that perspective and it makes some sense. What is interesting to me, Jake, is they kept McKinley Jackson for now. Does he become what if they land, because everyone's going to focus on like interior pass rush. What if they land like a beefy nose tackle via waivers? What if that's what they end up with? And that's how they address it. Like who's the odd man out then? That's what I think most people would say, oh, well, Eric Gregory bye, or maybe they try to sneak Howard Cross to the practice squad. But I do wonder, I'm not saying that would happen, but I do wonder how they view that room, depending, because I do still think, much like offensive line, I think they're still looking to add. They have 6 defensive tackles. I don't think they're going to hesitate if there's a guy they like on waivers.
Yeah, I think that's one of their biggest priorities. I mean,
Maybe
obviously
the
they only have 8 guys on the offensive line, so it's very easy to say that's their top priority to get to at least 9. I think they're going to want at least 9 guys there. But in terms of finding a guy that maybe could be active for you on game day, I think it's defensive tackle. My default answer to what they would do if they win a waiver claim for defensive tackle is that Eric Gregory and Howard Cross both go, because I'm assuming there would be another move as well. And they try to get both of those guys to the practice squad. I imagine just by default, that's what they do. But they like I said, don't shy away from finding ways to surprise us. And so if they went another direction, that shouldn't be shocking at this point. But I have a hard time thinking they're, as a team, from the front office, scouts, coaches, etc., ready to pull the plug on last year's 3rd round pick, because it's not like McKinley Jackson's been bad. They obviously
Agreed.
aren't happy with his consistency,
Yeah.
but it's not like he's out there looking like, and I hate to do this, like Zach Carter getting blown up 8 yards off the ball repeatedly. You know what I mean? Like it's not
Yes.
that level of like, man, what are they doing at defensive like, it's not like that with McKinley Jackson. He's not great, but there are flashes.
He had 3 tackles for loss in the preseason opener, and I get it. It was against a bunch of guys that were cut today, but it's still a thing. Like and he flashed some last year. And so I don't think so either. I just bring it up because I do think there are scenarios that are being discussed, and it is surprising that they go with 6. And so when you're unbalanced like this, usually things balance themselves out. And I would expect them to add an offensive lineman in the near future. If they add another defensive lineman, which could certainly happen, I think they want to in an ideal world, well, then they're going to have to make a move here. You can't have 12 defensive line. I mean, you can, but I'd be pretty surprised if they had 12 defensive linemen on their roster. Now, maybe that promising candidate that they're looking at defensive tackle, maybe they just sign that person to the practice squad and look that route initially. Maybe it isn't necessarily a waiver claim. It's a, hey, come play here because we desperately need help, and you could get acclimated quickly and we could get you up to speed. You never know.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. The other one that's interesting is how many defensive tackles are even active. So that's the other thing that I'm thinking about when I'm looking at the overall texture of the roster, right? Like, I think they're adding a 9th offensive lineman because all 8, like we said earlier, are going to be active. Probably activating 4 defensive tackles most weeks. Like most weeks, I think Gregory and Cross probably aren't active if they are on the 53-man roster. And a tight end, that's where it gets interesting. And I think we go there next because Cam Grandy makes it as a 5th tight end, but I can see a world where all 5 of those guys are active on game day. Or maybe there's some weeks that Grandy's up, maybe there's some weeks Hudson's up, and maybe that changes around a little bit, assuming they're all healthy, of course. But 5 tight ends on the initial roster. We have a couple of IR return moves from the Cincinnati Bengals that we should make sure we discuss as well. And we'll hit all of the rest of the notes here that are interesting about the Bengals' initial 53-man roster to finish up the show coming up next.
The NFL season is almost here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5. If your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. That's, well, essentially free money. All you got to do is sign up FanDuel.com right now. By the way, I was looking, Jake. The Bengals, well, they have the second best odds to win the North, which isn't really news. I think that's the case for a lot of people. They think that they're second in the division, but still plus 250. The Steelers plus 500. The Browns, no need to mention them. The Ravens minus 155. So whether it's division odds, whether it's all things NFL, now is the time to get to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app and get ready to play and take advantage of this offer right now where you can bet just $5. And when your bet wins, if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet.
Now, you obviously weren't surprised. And I wouldn't say I was surprised in the strict sense of the definition that Cam Grandy was the fifth tight end, that he made the initial 53. Maybe mildly surprised after the way things went after they signed Noah Fant. But the explanation is he's Drew Sample's backup. And Tanner Hudson is Mike Gesicki's backup. And Noah Fant is a bit of a unicorn who maybe Cam Grandy's backing up some of what he does, but doesn't have necessarily a direct comparison to the other tight ends in the roster. So that's how you can make it make sense. But what do you think in terms of like the game day rule? Do you think that there is a world where these five guys are up because Tanner Hudson and Cam Grandy and Drew Sample all have special teams roles in addition to potential offensive packages?
Yeah, I do think as of now, the way this is constructed, yeah, because you're going to have two defensive tackles that aren't active. You're going to find ways to, one of your six receivers is probably inactive. Maybe not. Maybe you go a different route, but I could see that. Like, it's really easy to pick it apart and get to a scenario where you need five. Now, I don't think that'll be every week, but to your point, they complement each other really well. And that's why Noah Fant, adding him made sense because it kind of rounded out the room. But Grandy, the Bengals like him and they value blocking, hence Drew Sample. And when you show you're reliable at it, it makes sense. And Cam Grandy, I think, is better as a pass catcher. I do. Not now. I'm not saying he's bringing a ton of juice, but I think he gives you a little bit more there than Drew Sample does and is a quality blocker. And so when I looked at the back end, and I think the Bengals did this too, when they looked at the back end of their roster, do you want to expose Cam Grandy, knowing that he's going to matter for you with all the uncertainty at offensive line and guys that you're comfortable trying to sneak onto the practice squad? I think that's what it came down to. And they were more comfortable going short an offensive line than defensive tackle. And they were certainly had their eyes and sights set on keeping all five tight ends, because if they weren't, then I think we would have noticed a dip in for Tanner Hudson. He might have played more the other day. Didn't. Cam Grandy, I think he played out of necessity as one of the key guys for Des Ridder. You know, I think that's kind of the logic there. They didn't have any backups that they thought could do what Cam can do, just to give him a chance in that final preseason game. So not surprised that they kept him. Still surprised, though, that it was because they went with 6 defensive tackles and 8 offensive linemen.
Yeah. I think the other thing that I would add for Cam Grandy is it's very possible, at least in my mind, that he is the heir apparent for Drew Sample. Drew Sample in the final year of his deal, certainly aging at this point in his NFL career from NFL standards. Cam Grandy younger, Cam Grandy a little bit more athletic. Cam Grandy may be the better player. That might be a bit of a hot take. He might be a better blocker. Maybe Drew Sample is a better pass blocker. But maybe in the run game, Cam Grandy's a little bit better. Certainly more athletic. Looks a little bit less awkward because I think he looks normal for a tight end with the ball in his hands as a receiver, where Drew Sample looks a little bit lumbering after catching a pass.
I think that's fair.
We saw that in the preseason. We've seen that throughout the career for Drew Sample. But sometimes Drew Sample gets downhill and is magnificent. So don't take that away from Drew Sample. The other, I don't know if it's quite a surprise, but the other spots that I think we had questions about were linebacker 5, where they land on only keeping 5 linebackers, and the linebacker that was captain last, Shaka Hayward, not Joe Giles Harris, is the guy that sticks. So they go with the younger option there. And as safety, PJ Jules makes the initial roster because Dejon Anthony is on the IR return, one of the 2 guys that the Bengals designated on the IR return at the time of cutdown. That's a new rule. So the other one is also Cedric Johnson. So Cedric Johnson, the defensive end, and Dejon Anthony headed to the IR return list with a calf designation for Cedric Johnson and a hamstring designation for Dejon Anthony, which didn't sound like it was necessarily super serious, but they start the year on IR.
And I do wonder, because you said because of Dejon going, I wonder what they would have done if
Yeah, I
Dejon's
guess.
just healthy.
Yeah, you're right.
And I'm not
It
trying to
really
be nitpicky with
simplifies
you.
it. It just simplifies the choice, right?
No doubt. And still an area where I could see them adding.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think the door is shut there. That's the theme, is I don't think this roster is finalized by any stretch, but did make it easy. PJ Jules, really good on special teams, hard worker, going to bring the effort, going to hit, going to do all the things that you need a 4th safety to do. Now, can they upgrade there? We'll see. What I think is interesting is the route they would go. Do they go young and try to find the next guy, or do they go and see if Justin Simmons is willing to play for a couple $1 million? I don't think that's something that that path they've gone down yet, but would you not now? I don't know. I think you could certainly, but that's probably not the route they go, just knowing the Bengals. I would be open to it, of course, but I do think that they're going to be eyeing safety. It's one of the multiple positions they'll be eyeing. I'm not sure they're eyeing linebacker. I'm not sure they're going to be eyeing wide receiver, tight end, but they're going to be open at a lot of these trench spots at safety. RB4, I could see, just because there's a lot of talent out there, I could see them going that route as well. So, and that might mean signing a guy to the practice squad for what it's worth. But I do think that there's multiple spots that they're potentially going to address with some new faces.
Yeah. I wonder if there's any interest at all in the veteran safeties that got cut. Tony Jefferson, Mike Edwards are the 2 that people are talking about in terms of veterans on Tuesday. Sorry, James, what?
Would you be in on either of those guys?
I think you could do worse than Tony Jefferson when you're talking about a backup safety. Yeah. I don't know how much Mike Edwards has left in the tank. It seemed like there's some slowdown happening for him, but again, could probably do worse. If you're talking about your backup safety, not really offering you a ton in the way of upside for either of those guys, but at this point in the year, I'm not sure how much upside there is generally available. I also wonder how much interest they have. So, like, in terms of defining priorities, right? Safety, defensive tackle, offensive line. Those haven't changed. Nothing changes about that based on the guys they kept in either of our minds, even though they went heavy at defensive tackle, even though they have a great story in PJ Jules, a guy that played really well and earned that opportunity. They only have 8 guys on the offensive line. So I think those are still the priorities. But I wonder if they're looking at their pass rush and thinking, like, yeah, it'd be good to add something in terms of pass rush upside. I wonder what that could look like for them. I think they're pretty set on edge. Trey, Miles, Shamar, Osai, Sample. Cedric Johnson on IR should probably get him back at some point this year. But I wonder what their thoughts are there with a couple of interesting players that were released at that spot. So always interesting to see where the waiver claims are. The Bengals 17th in waiver priority this year. So a little bit down in the order. They will not have their pick of anybody they want who's been waived, but I think that we're going to see some moves happening here, as we've been discussing for the last few episodes, despite the initial cut down. And there always are, but more so than ever this year, there's some parts of this roster that they've put together that are screaming for follow-up moves.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And I'm trying to think, are there any veterans? They did this with Mike Thomas, the receiver, a few years ago. Are there any veterans they could cut to make room for one of these claimed guys and then bring back a day later? I'm trying to think of who it would be. I mean, they're so much younger now that it's tough to.
Yeah, I mean,
tough to
you're talking.
envision.
You're talking about like the veteran minimum guys too
Yeah,
at that
yeah.
point.
I'm just trying to remember, like, picture. I'm pulling up the depth chart now to see if I can think of anyone that they could.
The
Because I don't
ones
want
that
people to be surprised by a random cut. That's all. But there aren't many,
I
honestly.
don't necessarily anticipate it this year compared to previous years. Like they feel less set. Like there's some guys that really feels like they're protecting them from waivers, but the guys that stand out to me from that perspective, because they have to miss a day of practice. Like if they had other guys on the offensive line, I would say Cody Ford, but because they only have 8, I don't think that that's really going to happen. And Cody Ford is their 6th lineman, so that'd be a little bit crazy. Samaje Perine as a veteran,
Marco Wilson. There
is
we go.
he not subject to waivers at this point? I wasn't sure.
I don't believe so.
Because if not, that would be
Yeah, he's entering his 5th season, so I think he's fine.
Yeah. So that could be one too.
So that's one. So point is don't panic if there's one of those type guys. Could Cam Sample be? Cam Sample?
I thought about Cam Sample too. He's on his 2nd contract.
Yeah. So there's a few guys that if they want to do the gymnastics to protect whoever, there's a chance they could do that. But there's not many options. There's not as much flexibility there because a lot of these guys are on rookie deals or extensions.
And the terminology that you're looking for there, if that does happen, is waived versus released or terminated. Contracts being terminated. Bengals.com saying terminated the contracts of 3 vested veterans in Jalen Davis, Joe Giles Harrison, Gary Brightwell. And heck, some of those guys could be back on the team in some capacity as well. Now that you point that note out, probably not Gary Brightwell, but that's the terminology difference you're looking for. If they're waived, that means they're subject to the waiver process where teams can put claims in and take those contracts on, put them on the 53-man roster. But we'll see how that all shakes out. Until next time, that's going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Thanks for listening. Hoo day, and have a good one.